Hey, glad you made it back. Before we dig into tonight's story from the graveyard, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I want to know who's still brave enough to walk among the graves with me. Now sit tight, and don't mind the sound of dirt. It's just the gravedigger getting ready. Have you ever noticed how a cemetery changes after dark? How the familiar monuments transform into looming silhouettes, and the well-trodden paths become uncertain terrain. I've spent most of my adult life working among the dead, and still, there are nights when Willow Hill Cemetery becomes a foreign landscape to me. Listen to the rain for a moment, the steady drum against your roof, your windows. It's comforting from inside, isn't it? But imagine being out in it, alone, surrounded by graves, the water seeping into soil beneath your feet, softening the earth, perhaps loosening what lies within it. My name is Edward Graves. Yes, I'm aware of the irony. 26 years as the sexton of Willow Hill Cemetery. The locals often joke that I was destined for the job with a surname like mine. Perhaps they're right. There are times I feel as though this place chose me rather than the other way around. Willow Hill sits on the outskirts of a small village in Cornwall, perched on a gentle slope overlooking the sea. It's old, parts of it dating back to the 1600s, and carries all the character and peculiarities one might expect of a burial ground with such history. Ancient yew trees with gnarled trunks line the northern wall. Victorian angels with weathered faces guard family plots. Simple wooden crosses mark paupers' graves in the far corner. And everywhere beneath the surface is a clay. Rich, red Cornish clay. Dense and smooth when dry, slick and treacherous when wet. Clay that stains your clothes, your skin, your tools. Clay that remembers the shape of what it once held, long after that thing is gone. I learned about the clay's unusual properties during my first year at Willow Hill. It had been raining for days, not unlike tonight, and I was digging a grave in the newer section. The plot belonged to a widow of a local fisherman, to be buried alongside her husband, who had preceded her by some 15 years. As my shovel bit into the soil, I noticed something strange. The deeper I went, the more the clay changed color, transitioning from its typical rusty red to a pale, almost flesh-like pink, and it was warm to the touch, despite the chilly autumn air. Most peculiar of all, as I neared the depth of the previous burial, I began to make out distinct impressions in the clay, negative spaces where the fisherman's coffin had rested. But there was more than just the rectangular outline one might expect. There were impressions within that space, curved indentations that looked disturbingly like a body, as if the man himself had left his imprint directly in the clay, the wood of his coffin having rotted away completely. I'd seen unusual things in my line of work before. Burial grounds are places of strange occurrences. But this unnerved me. The impression was so detailed, so precise. I could make out the curve of shoulders, the subtle depression where the face would have been, even the outline of folded hands across the chest. "Morning, Mr. Graves. Find anything interesting down there?" The voice startled me. I looked up to see Elias Penhallow, the cemetery's groundskeeper and the only other full-time employee at Willow Hill. He was an old man even then, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to belong to someone who had seen far more than his share of life's darker aspects. "Look at this." I called up to him, gesturing at the impression in the clay. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" Elias climbed down into the grave with surprising agility for a man of his years. He studied the clay impressions in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "The clay remembers, Mr. Graves. That's what my father told me, and his father before him. The clay of Willow Hill remembers what's been buried in it." I laughed, though the sound fell flat in the open grave. "That's just decomposition and soil settlement," I said, with the confidence of someone who has yet to learn how little they actually know. Nothing supernatural about it. Elias didn't argue, just shrugged those bony shoulders of his. Believe what you like, Mr. Graves, but mind the clay when it rains heavy. That's when it speaks clearest. He climbed out of the grave and was gone before I could question him further. I dismiss his warning as a superstition of an old man raised on local folklore. I completed the widow's grave, attended her funeral the following day, and thought no more about clay that remembers or speaks until 3 weeks later, when the rains came again. It was a night much like this one, a relentless downpour that continued for hours, saturating the ground and turning the cemetery paths into shallow streams. I'd stayed late to secure a tarpaulin over a freshly dug grave, knowing from experience how quickly a rainstorm could transform an empty plot into a muddy pond. As I was leaving, making my way carefully along the slippery main path, I heard it, a sound so incongruous that I initially struggled to identify it. A child's laughter, high and clear, cutting through the patter of rain. I froze, scanning the darkened cemetery. Willow Hill was closed after dusk, its wrought iron gates locked to prevent vandalism. There should have been no one there but me. Hello? I called out, my voice swallowed by the rain. The cemetery is closed. You need to leave. No response. Just another peal of laughter, now from a different direction, toward the oldest section, where lichen-covered headstones tilted at precarious angles and most inscriptions had long since weathered away. I should have left. Should have assumed it was local teenagers playing some prank, or simply my imagination conjuring sounds from a rainfall. Instead, I followed the laughter, my torch beam cutting through the darkness as I made my way between ancient graves. The sound led me to a small, sunken area encircled by yew trees, what the locals call the Children's Corner, a tragic legacy of a scarlet fever outbreak in the 1830s that had claimed dozens of young lives in the span of a few terrible weeks. Small headstones, many bearing carvings of sleeping lambs or broken flower stems, marked their final resting places. It was from this place that the laughter seemed to emanate, not from above the ground, but somehow from within it, as if the sound were bubbling up through the rain-soaked earth. And then I saw them, impressions forming in the soft clay between the graves. Footprints, small, child-sized footprints appearing in real time, as if invisible feet were dancing across the ground. They formed intricate patterns, overlapping and interweaving, reminiscent of the kind of playground games children played in a more innocent era. I stood transfixed, my torch beam highlighting the impossible scene unfolding before me. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations, gas escaping from decomposing remains, some peculiar geological phenomenon, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But none of these could account for what happened next. One set of footprints detached from the others, moving deliberately in my direction. Small, bare feet pressing into the clay, one after another, approaching where I stood frozen at the edge of the Children's Corner. They stopped just short of my boots. Then, before my disbelieving eyes, a handprint appeared in the mud beside the footprints. Tiny fingers splayed as if a child had placed their hand upon the ground. Hello, I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Who's there? The laughter came again, directly at my feet now. Then a voice, high and sweet, with a distinctive Cornish lilt common to the area. Will you play with us, mister? We've been waiting ever so long for someone new. I'd like to tell you that I responded with courage or curiosity, that I engaged with the supernatural phenomenon with the scientific interest it deserved. But the truth is, I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the cemetery, slipping and sliding on the rain-slick paths, not stopping until I'd reached the safety of my cottage at the cemetery gates. I spent that night with every light burning, jumping at each creak of the old building settling, each tap of rain against the windows. By morning, I'd nearly convinced myself that stress and poor visibility had caused me to imagine the entire episode. Nearly, but not quite. When the rain finally stopped around midday, I ventured back to the children's corner, telling myself I was simply checking for storm damage. The ground had begun to dry under the weak autumn sun, the clay already firming up, and there, just as I had feared and expected, were the footprints, dozens of them, overlapping in those same playful patterns. And at the edge where I had stood, a single small handprint pressed into the red clay. I filled a bucket with water from the groundskeeper's shed and erased the evidence, smoothing the clay with a trowel until no trace of the previous night's impossibility remained. I told no one, not even Elias, especially not Elias, whose words now echoed uncomfortably in my mind. The clay remembers. That's when it speaks clearest. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I never again experienced anything unusual at Willow Hill. But that would be a lie. Over the years, I've witnessed the clay of Willow Hill remember in ways that defy rational explanation. During heavy rains, I've seen impressions form the ground above long-buried remains, handprints appearing over graves when no living hand was present, footsteps tracking across the grounds when the cemetery was empty save for me. I've heard voices rising from the soil, snippets of conversation, laughter, occasionally weeping, always strongest during rainfall, as if the water somehow conducts these echoes from below to above. The most active areas are always the oldest sections, where the dead have had longest to impress themselves upon the clay. Are you still with me? Can you hear the rain drumming outside your window? Good, because I need you to understand what I discovered last month. During the worst downpour our village has seen in decades, I'd been called to the cemetery at midnight. An unusual occurrence, but not unprecedented. The caller identified himself as a council official, concerned about flooding in the lower sections of the grounds. When I arrived, drenched despite my raincoat, I found Willow Hill deserted. No council official, no emergency, just sheets of rain turning the cemetery into a quagmire. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd about the main path. The clay seemed to be moving, not washing away with the rain, but undulating, as if something beneath were pushing upward, testing its boundaries. I approached cautiously, my torch beam illuminating the strange phenomenon. The clay bubbled and shifted, forming what appeared to be the impression of a face, a perfect negative space, as if someone were pressing their features upward from below. Eyes, nose, mouth, all rendered in such detail that I could make out the furrow of brows, the curve of lips. Then another face formed beside it, and another, all along the path. The clay was remembering faces, dozens of them, of all ages and expressions, emerging from the ground like a macabre art installation. I recognized some of them. A local magistrate I'd buried 2 winters prior, an elderly schoolteacher from my first year as sexton, the fisherman whose grave had first revealed the clay's strange properties to me. As I watched, horrified yet unable to look away, the face impressions began to speak, mouths moving in the clay, voices rising from the earth, overlapping into a cacophony that somehow remained intelligible. The clay holds us. We cannot rest. Memory traps us here. Help us, Sexton. Release us. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as my foot caught on an exposed tree root. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice shaking. How can I help you? The faces shifted, some receding as others pushed forward. One emerged more prominently than the rest. An old man I recognized with shock as Elias Penhallow, my former groundskeeper who had passed away some 5 years earlier. The clay remembers too well. Edward. Elias's impression spoke, his voice exactly as I remembered it. It won't let us fade, won't let us pass on. Each time it rains, we're pulled back, shaped again by the clay's memory. What can I do? I asked, rain streaming down my face, mingling with tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. Change the clay. The impression spoke in unison. their voices harmonizing in an unsettling chord. Mix it, turn it, let it forget us. The council would never approve exhuming the entire cemetery. I protested. It's not possible. The face of the fisherman pushed forward. Not all at once. But you have time, Sexton. Each new grave you dig, each old one you maintain. Mix the clay. Bring soil from elsewhere. Dilute the memory. Release us, they pleaded, the chorus of voices rising with the rain. Let us truly rest. I promised I would try. What else could I do? These were people I had known, had helped later rest. If their rest was disturbed by the clay's unnatural memory, wasn't it my duty to help them? The next day, I began. With each new grave, I now remove a portion of the clay and replace it with soil brought from outside the cemetery. With each maintenance task, each repair a sunken grave or tilted headstone, I mix the clay, turning it, diluting its memory with fresh earth. The council, of course, knows nothing of my true purpose. They see only a dedicated sexton, perhaps becoming a bit eccentric in his later years, but diligent in his duties. It's slow work. At my current pace, it will take decades to refresh enough of Willow Hill's clay to make a significant difference. I won't live to see it completed, but perhaps my successor will continue the task, especially if they, too, witness what the clay remembers during heavy rains. And that brings me to why I'm sharing this story with you tonight. As the rain falls outside your window, 3 days ago, I received a letter from the village council. After 26 years of service, they've decided to modernize cemetery operations. My position is being eliminated, replaced by a maintenance contract with a landscaping firm based in the nearest city. I have 2 weeks to vacate the sexton's cottage. 2 weeks to somehow explain to my replacement, who will visit only twice monthly to perform the most cursory of maintenance, about the clay of Willow Hill, about its memory, about the obligation we who tend the dead have to those who cannot truly rest. Would you believe such a tale, told by an aging cemetery keeper on the verge of unemployment? Would you undertake a decades-long task based on voices in the clay and faces pressed upward from below? No, I wouldn't either. So tonight, as the rain falls heavier than it has in years, I've made a decision. I'm going to give the dead of Willow Hill what they've asked for, not gradually over decades, but tonight, all at once. The landscaping company delivered their equipment yesterday. A small excavator, a soil tiller, tools for their future work. They won't miss them until I'm finished. By morning, every section of Willow Hill will have its clay turned, mixed, its memory disrupted. The dead will finally be allowed to rest. Will the council dismiss me immediately? Almost certainly. Will there be legal consequences? Possibly. But after 26 years as sexton, after all I've witnessed in the rain-soaked clay of Willow Hill, these concerns seem trivial compared to the peace I might finally grant those trapped in clay's perfect memory. So if you're passing by Willow Hill Cemetery tonight, and you hear the sound of machinery over the rainfall, now you understand. It's just a grave digger, fulfilling his final duty to those in his care. And if you visit the cemetery in future years, pay close attention during heavy rains. Watch the clay between the graves. Listen for voices rising from soil. If you hear nothing, see nothing but ordinary mud and puddles, then I've succeeded. The clay is forgotten, and the dead of Willow Hill are truly at rest. But if you notice a handprint forming where no hand has touched, or hear a child's laughter when the cemetery stands empty, or glimpse a face pressing upward to the rain-soaked ground, well, perhaps you'll consider taking up where I left off. After all, the clay remembers, and someone must help it forget. Listen, the rain is getting heavier now. Can you hear anything else beneath its rhythm? Any voices speaking your name? Any memory of you already stored in the clay that will someday receive your body? The clay remembers us all, you know, long before we're buried in it. And on nights like this, when the boundary between earth and sky blurs with rainfall, it speaks most clearly of all. Hey, if you're still here with me at this point in the story, type in the comments. The earth is still fresh. That way I'll know who's really following it to the end, and who's already been taken in by the silence of the cemetery. Let's see who's brave enough to comment. I never wanted to be a gravedigger. That wasn't the plan at all. I'd studied architecture at university, had dreams of designing sleek modern buildings that would transform city skylines. But then my father died and everything changed. The rain's coming down rather heavily tonight, isn't it? That rhythmic patter against your windows. It's almost like fingertips tapping, asking to be let in. I've grown accustomed to that sound over the years. In my line of work, rain is both friend and enemy. It softens the earth, making digging easier, but also fills the graves, creating muddy pools that must be emptied before a burial can proceed. My name is Daniel Lockwood. For the past 7 years, I've been a caretaker of St. Michael's Cemetery in a small village just outside Oxford. The position came to me through inheritance. My father had tended these grounds for nearly 30 years before his heart gave out one autumn morning while digging a grave for the local vicar's sister. I'd been away, living in London, working in an architectural firm, building what I thought would be my career. When the call came about Father's death, I returned to arrange his funeral, and I'd assumed to settle his affairs before heading back to my life. That changed when Mr. Winters, the family solicitor, informed me of the unusual terms of my father's will. The position of St. Michael's caretaker has been in your family for generations, he explained, adjusting his spectacles as he peered at the documents before him. Your father was most insistent that the tradition continue. I laughed, assuming it was some sort of joke. I'm an architect, Mr. Winters. I don't dig graves. Nevertheless, he continued, unperturbed, your father has stipulated that you must serve as caretaker for a minimum of 7 years. Should you refuse, his entire estate, including the cottage, which I must remind you has been in your family for over 200 years, will be donated to the church. I was stunned. The cottage was my childhood home, filled with memories and family heirlooms. More practically, it was worth a considerable sum, certainly more than my London flat with its crushing mortgage. This is ridiculous, I protested. He can't force me to become a gravedigger from beyond the grave. Mr. Winters removed his glasses, fixing me with a steady gaze. Your father was adamant, Daniel. He said you would understand the importance of maintaining a family connection to St. Michael's eventually. He paused. He also said to tell you that someone must keep watch. Those last words struck me oddly. Keep watch? Over what? A cemetery filled with long-dead villagers? Still, I couldn't bear to lose a cottage, and I told myself 7 years would pass quickly enough. I could perhaps do some architectural work remotely, and so, with great reluctance, I accepted my inheritance and the obligation that came with it. The cemetery board was surprisingly accommodating. My father had been well respected, and they seemed to find it perfectly natural that I would step into his role. They provided a brief orientation to my duties, maintaining grounds, preparing graves, assisting with funerals, keeping records, locking the gates at dusk. What they didn't mention, what no one mentioned, was the vigil. I discovered quite by accident, about 3 months into my new position. I was organizing my father's office in a small stone building at the cemetery entrance when I found a locked drawer in his desk. The key was not among those he'd left, but after some searching, I discovered it hanging on a nail inside a hollow space in the wall, concealed behind a calendar. Inside the drawer was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age, filled with entries dating back to 1843. The first entry was written by Josiah Lockwood, my great-great-great-grandfather, if I calculated correctly. Tonight marks my first vigil as caretaker of St. Michael's. He had written in a spidery hand. Father explained the responsibility thoroughly, though I confess I did not believe him until I witnessed it with my own eyes. The rain came just after midnight, and with it, the visitor. I maintained the boundary as instructed. The sun rises now. All is well. The entries continued through the decades, passing from Josiah to his son Edward, then to Samuel, to George, to my grandfather Thomas, and finally to my father James. Each recorded their vigils, always during rainstorms, always at night, always involving something referred to only as the visitor and maintaining the boundary. My father's last entry was dated just 3 days before his death. Rain tonight. Heavy. The visitor was more persistent than usual, testing the boundary repeatedly. I fear I am growing too old for this duty. Daniel must return soon. He must be told. The visitor grows stronger, and someone must keep watch. A chill ran through me as I read those words. The same phrase Mr. Winters had relayed from my father. Keep watch. But over what? What was this visitor? What boundary needed maintaining? I spent the next days reading the journal carefully, searching for explanations. The entries were often cryptic, assuming a knowledge passed down verbally rather than written explicitly. But certain patterns emerged. The vigils always occurred during rainstorms. They always took place in the oldest section of St. Michael's, where graves dated back to the 1600s. The visitors seemed to be attracted to fresh burials, but constrained by something called a boundary, which the caretakers maintained through means never clearly described. Most disturbing were the entries that hinted at consequences when the vigil was neglected or the boundary weakened. 1879, April 17th. Failed to maintain vigil due to illness. The visitor crossed partially. Matilda Wells found wandering at dawn, unresponsive, eyes blank. Her husband buried just yesterday. Must not happen again. 1923, November 4th. Edward neglected his post, drinking at the Red Lion rather than maintaining the boundary during the storm. The visitor took young Peter Collins. Body found by the north wall, unmarked but cold as January frost. No more neglect will be tolerated. The last such incident recorded was in 1967, during my grandfather's tenure. The boundary failed during an unusually powerful storm. 3 villagers affected before I could restore it. The church believes it a case of mass hysteria. Better they think that than know the truth. What truth? What exactly was happening in St. Michael's Cemetery during rainstorms? What had my family been keeping watch over for generations? I might have dismissed it all as superstition, the eccentric tradition of a family too long associated with death and burial. Had the rain not come that very night, it began gently enough, a soft patter against the cottage windows as I prepared for bed. By midnight, it had intensified into a proper downpour. I was nearly asleep when I remembered the journal's emphasis on maintaining the vigil during rainstorms. This is absurd, I told myself, turning over to find a more comfortable position. I'm not going to the cemetery in the middle of the night because of some family superstition. But sleep wouldn't come. My father's final written words echoed in my mind. The visitor grows stronger, and someone must keep watch. What if there was something to it? What if my family had been protecting the village from something all these years? With a sigh of resignation, I dressed, donned my raincoat, and ventured out into the storm. St. Michael's was only a short walk from the cottage, but by the time I reached the wrought iron gates, I was soaked through. The rain had become torrential, making visibility poor even with my torch. The cemetery looked transformed in the darkness. Familiar monuments turned strange and threatening, yew trees swaying like spectral guardians. I unlocked the gates and made my way to the oldest section, where weathered headstones tilted at odd angles and ancient family mausoleums stood like miniature fortresses against time. The journal had never specified exactly where in this section the vigil should be maintained, so I positioned myself at its center, feeling increasingly foolish as rain streamed down my face. "Well, I'm here," I announced to the empty cemetery, though I haven't the faintest idea what I'm supposed to be doing. For several minutes, I stood there in the downpour, questioning my sanity. The visitor was clearly nothing more than family folklore, a story passed down through generations of cemetery caretakers who spent too much time among the dead. I was about to leave when I noticed something unusual about the rainfall directly in front of me, rather than falling straight down. The raindrops seemed to be avoiding a particular area, a roughly circular space about 3 meters in diameter where not a single drop fell, despite the downpour surrounding it. As I watched, transfixed, the dry space began to move, gliding between graves with deliberate purpose. It wasn't the wind creating some strange meteorological phenomenon. There was hardly any breeze. The circle of dryness moved independently, like an invisible umbrella floating through the cemetery. It approached a fresh grave, Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, buried just that morning, and paused. The headstone hadn't yet been placed, just a temporary marker bearing her name. As the dry circle hovered over her grave, the soil began to shift and bulge, as if something beneath were pushing upward. A visceral fear gripped me then, an instinctive recognition of something deeply wrong. This was the visitor. This was what my family had been watching for generations. Without conscious thought, I found myself moving forward, my father's walking stick, which I brought almost as an afterthought, raised before me. Words rose to my lips, words I'd never heard before yet somehow knew. By salt and stone and Lockwood bone, the boundary holds. You may not pass. The dry circle seemed to pulse, expanding slightly before contracting. The disturbed soil of Eleanor Simmons' grave settled. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the rain directly around the dry circle began to fall upward, defying gravity. Drops rose in the ground, hovering momentarily before being pulled into the circle of dryness, where they vanished. More followed, a reverse rainfall that grew stronger with each passing second. And as the rain was absorbed, the dry space began to take on a faint outline, a shimmering, translucent form that suggested a figure much taller and thinner than any human ought to be. By salt and stone and Lockwood bone, I repeated, my voice shaking now. The boundary holds. You may not pass. The shimmering figure turned toward me. Though it had no discernible face, I felt its attention shift, sensed its focus like a physical weight. It drifted closer, the circle of dryness now just meters from where I stood. For the first time, I noticed a pattern on the ground, a faint line of slightly different colored grass forming a circle around the oldest section of the cemetery. The boundary, I realized, the line the visitor could not cross, unless the vigil was neglected. The shimmering figure reached the boundary and stopped. It seemed to study the invisible barrier, testing it with what might have been a limb. Where it touched, the rain fell normally for a moment before being repelled again. You don't belong here, I said, surprised at myself with my boldness. Return to your own place. A sound emanated from the figure, not heard with my ears, but felt in my mind. A sound like distant voices arguing, overlapping and contradicting each other. And beneath them, a deeper voice that spoke directly to me. New watcher, untrained, boundary weakens. The words weren't English, weren't any language I recognized, yet I understood them perfectly. The boundary holds, I insisted, stepping closer to the faint line on the ground. My family has maintained it for generations. It will not fail tonight. Your father is gone. His strength is gone. You are not ready. As if to demonstrate its point, the figure pressed against the boundary again, and this time the invisible barrier visibly rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. The shimmering form pushed harder, and a portion of its substance, like smoke made solid, extended across the line. Panic rose within me. I had no idea what would happen if the visitor fully breached the boundary, but the journal entries had made clear it would be disastrous. Eleanor Simmons might rise from a fresh grave, empty-eyed and cold. Or worse, the visitor might seek out the living, as it apparently had in 1923. Acting on instinct, I drove the end of my father's walking stick into ground directly on the boundary line. The wood, which I thought was ordinary hawthorn, began to glow with a faint blue light. The portion of the visitor that had crossed the line recoiled as if burned. Salt and stone and Lockwood bone. I said again, the words feeling more natural now, the boundary holds. I reached into my pocket and withdrew my house keys. Among them was an ornate old key that had belonged to my father, its purpose unknown to me. Now, somehow, I knew what it was for. I pressed it against the walking stick, and the blue glow intensified. The visitor retreated fully behind the boundary, its shimmering form undulating in what might have been frustration or pain. The old ways remain, it acknowledged, that deep voice resonating in my mind. But for how long, new watcher? How long until you tire of your inheritance? Until you return to your towers of glass and steel? Who will maintain the boundary then? The question struck at my core. It was right. I had accepted this position reluctantly, with every intention of abandoning it once my 7 years were complete. I had no attachment to St. Michael's beyond obligation, but as I stood there in the rain, facing an entity from beyond normal understanding, I realized something had changed within me. This was more than a job, more than a family tradition. It was a responsibility, a sacred trust that had been passed down through generations of Lockwoods. I will maintain it, I said, conviction growing with each word, for as long as necessary, as my father did, as his father did before him. The visitor seemed to study me, its formless shape shifting constantly within the circle of dryness. We shall see, new watcher. We shall see. With that, the shimmering figure began to fade, the reverse rainfall slowing until it stopped completely. The circle of dryness diminished until it vanished entirely, leaving only normal rain falling on undisturbed graves. I remained at my post until dawn, though the visitor did not return that night. As the first light broke through the storm clouds, I finally understood what my father had meant. Someone must keep watch. Not just anyone, a Lockwood. We were bound to this place, to this duty, by something deeper than legal obligation. That was 7 years ago. My architectural career is long abandoned now. I've since learned much more about my family's responsibility from journals and records hidden throughout the cottage. The visitor, or visitors, for there are apparently many, are entities that exist in a parallel plane to our own. They are drawn to the recently deceased, seeking to use them as vessels to enter our world. The boundary was established in 1656 by Jeremiah Lockwood, the first caretaker of St. Michael's, using arts now forgotten. It must be maintained through regular vigils, especially during rainstorms, which thin the separation between worlds. My initial 7-year commitment expired last month. Mr. Winters contacted me, asking if I wished to formally continue as caretaker or transfer the property. I signed the papers extending my position without hesitation. The rain continues to fall tonight, harder than I've seen in years. I'll be going out soon to maintain the vigil, to ensure the boundary holds. But before I do, I want to share this story with you. You see, I've learned one more thing from my father's hidden records. The Lockwood line is ending with me. I have no children, no siblings, no cousins to inherit this duty when I'm gone. The boundary will need a new watcher eventually, someone willing to learn the old ways, to take up the responsibility that has been my family's for over 3 centuries. Listen to the rain. Really listen. Can you hear the subtle differences in its rhythm? The patterns that repeat just often enough to suggest intelligence rather than randomness? That's them, testing the boundaries of their world and ours, seeking entry. They are patient. They have existed since before humanity built its first cities, and they will continue long after our civilization crumbles. But for now, for this moment in time, they are contained. The boundary holds. Perhaps, if you're hearing this, it's not by chance. Perhaps you're meant to learn these things, to prepare for a time when the Lockwood Vigil can no longer be maintained by a Lockwood. So I ask you, when the rain falls at midnight and something moves in the darkness between graves, will you be ready to keep watch? Will you maintain the boundary that protects the living from what waits beyond? Think carefully before you answer. Some inheritances once accepted can never be set aside. The rain is growing stronger now. I must go to St. Michael's. The visitor will be waiting. But remember, if ever you see rainfall that defies gravity or a circle of dryness moving with purpose through a storm, speak the words. By salt and stone and Lockwood bone, the boundary holds. You may not pass. It might just save your life, and many others besides. The sound of rain against a coffin lid is different from any other sound in the world. Have you ever heard it? That hollow patter, muffled yet somehow amplified within a confined space, like fingertips drumming impatiently, waiting for attention. It's a sound I've become intimately familiar with over the years, a sound that haunts my dreams. The rain's quite heavy tonight, isn't it? Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Can you hear how it changes rhythm occasionally, almost forming patterns? Good. Then you might understand what I'm about to tell you. My name is Jonathan Blackwood. For 15 years, I served as gravedigger at Ravenswood Cemetery, a sprawling Victorian burial ground on the outskirts of Edinburgh. It wasn't a career I planned. Few children dream of spending their days excavating the earth of the dead. But after leaving the military with few prospects and fewer qualifications, the position offered stability and solitude, both of which I desperately needed. There's a peculiar peacefulness to cemetery work during daylight hours, the methodical labor, the quiet reverence of mourners, the sense of providing a final service to those who have passed. I found an unexpected comfort in my routine, measuring plots, digging graves of precise dimensions, assisting with funerals, maintaining the grounds. But night work was different. Most burials occurred during the day, of course, but occasionally, circumstances require after-hours interments. A religious necessity, a delayed transport of remains, sometimes simply scheduling conflicts that push a service past sunset. These nocturnal burials were rare, perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, and always carried a surcharge, part which came to me as compensation for the unsociable hours. I didn't mind them, generally speaking. The cemetery took on a different character after dark, certainly. Monuments casting longer shadows, marble angels seeming more watchful than benevolent. But I'd never been one for superstition. The dead were dead. My job was simply provide them a proper resting place. Or so I believed, until the night of Alexander Montgomery's burial. It was 7 years ago, during a November storm much like the one raging outside your window now. The rain had been falling steadily since morning, a consistent downpour that turned the cemetery paths to streams and made my work doubly difficult. Montgomery, a wealthy businessman with no family but very specific funeral instructions, was to be interred at exactly midnight in the family mausoleum, a grandiose structure of gray stone and wrought iron that hadn't been opened in decades. I'd spent most of the day clearing the mausoleum entrance of encroaching ivy and making sure the ancient door mechanism still functioned. By evening, I was exhausted, soaked to the skin despite my waterproofs, and thoroughly irritated by the eccentricity of the deceased demands. Who insists on being buried at bloody midnight? I grumbled to myself as I waited in the shelter of my small cemetery office for the funeral party to arrive. In a rainstorm, no less. The service was to be minimal, just a minister, the solicitor overseeing Montgomery's estate, and myself. No mourners, no flowers, no speeches. Just a simple blessing before the coffin was sealed inside the mausoleum alongside generations of Montgomerys long forgotten by the world. At precisely 11:45 p.m., a sleek black car pulled through the cemetery gates, its headlights cutting through the curtain of rain. The minister, a thin, nervous-looking man I didn't recognize from local churches, emerged first, followed by the solicitor, a severe woman in her 50s clutching a leather portfolio as if it contained state secrets. The hearse arrived moments later, bearing Montgomery's coffin, an elaborate affair of polished mahogany with silver fittings that gleamed dully in the poor light. Between the three of us, we managed to transfer it onto the wheeled bier I prepared, and our strange procession set off through the rain-lashed cemetery toward the Montgomery mausoleum. Dreadful night for it, the minister commented, raising his voice above the downpour. Mr. Montgomery was most insistent about the timing, the solicitor replied. His instructions were extremely detailed. Any particular religious reason? I asked, genuinely curious. I've handled midnight burials for certain faith traditions before. Not religious, no, the solicitor said. She hesitated, then added. Mr. Montgomery believed that midnight was when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. He had some rather unconventional beliefs about what occurs after death. Superstitious nonsense, the minister muttered, then looked immediately embarrassed by his unprofessional comment. I said nothing, focusing instead on navigating the bier along the slippery path. But something about the solicitor's words nagged at me. The barrier between worlds is thinnest. It was an odd phrase, one that echoed in my mind as we approached the mausoleum. The structure loomed before us, its stone facade slick with rain, the family name carved above the entrance barely visible in the beam of my torch. I unlocked the heavy iron door, which swung open with a groan of ancient hinges that seemed unervingly like a human moan. The interior was just as I'd left it earlier, clean but musty, with stones shelved along three walls holding the coffins of Montgomery ancestors. A central platform, currently empty, awaited the newest arrival. The air inside was noticeably colder than the November night outside, and surprisingly dry given the rain. We positioned the coffin on the central platform. The minister performed a perfunctory service, his words echoing strangely in enclosed space. Throughout his recitation, the solicitor kept checking her watch, as if timing were of critical importance. At exactly 1 minute to midnight, she interrupted. I apologize, Reverend, but we must complete the interment precisely at the hour. Mr. Montgomery was most explicit about this detail. The minister, looking affronted but professional, nodded and quickly concluded his blessing. As the final words left his lips, the solicitor stepped forward and placed a small silver object atop the coffin. A pocket watch, I realized, its case intricately engraved with symbols I didn't recognize. It's time, she said, glancing at her own watch. We must seal the mausoleum now. We exited, and I closed the heavy door, turning the large key in its lock. As the mechanism clicked into place, I could have sworn I heard something from within, a faint ticking, far too loud to be coming from the small pocket watch, echoing within the stone chamber. Did you hear that? I asked, but the minister was already hurrying back toward the waiting cars, eager to be out of the rain. The solicitor lingered, fixing me with an intense gaze. Mr. Montgomery left specific instructions that the mausoleum is not to be open again under any circumstances. Not for maintenance, not for future family interments. Though there are none, Not for any reason whatsoever. The cemetery board has been compensated generously to ensure this condition is met. She pressed an envelope into my hand. This is for you personally. A token of Mr. Montgomery's appreciation for your assistance tonight. Before I could respond, she turned and followed the minister, disappearing into the downpour. I stood alone by the mausoleum, rain streaming down my face, that strange ticking sound still playing in my memory. Back in my office, I opened the envelope to find £500 in cash and a handwritten note. To the caretaker Ravenswood, thank you for your service on this significant night. What you have helped accomplish is more important than you can possibly understand. In gratitude for your discretion, please accept this gift. Should you hear anything unusual from my resting place in coming days, I implore you to ignore it. Under no circumstances should the mausoleum door be opened before sunrise. A. Montgomery. I counted the money again, wondering what sort of unusual sounds Montgomery had anticipated. The whole business was bizarre, but the cemetery had its share of eccentric permanent residents. £500 bought a great deal of discretion for what was likely nothing more than the superstitious request of a wealthy oddball. I locked the note and money in my desk drawer, completed my paperwork for the night, and prepared to leave. The rain continued unabated, drumming against the office roof with near-mechanical regularity. As I donned my coat, I realized I had left my good torch by the Montgomery Mausoleum in confusion of the hasty departure. Cursing under my breath, I grabbed a spare light and headed back out into the storm. The cemetery was eerily quiet despite the rainfall, the usual urban background noise dampened by the weather and the late hour. My footsteps on the gravel path seemed unnaturally loud as I made my way back to the mausoleum. I found my torch where I'd left it, propped against the wall beside the entrance. As I bent to retrieve it, I noticed something odd. Despite the torrential rain, the ground immediately surrounding the mausoleum was completely dry, a perfect circle of perhaps 3 meters diameter, centered on the structure, where not a single raindrop fell. I stepped into this inexplicable dry zone, looking up to see if some architectural feature in the mausoleum was somehow diverting the rainfall. There was nothing, just open sky above, filled with clouds and falling water that seemed to curve around an invisible dome covering the area. And then I heard it, that ticking sound again, much louder now, not like a pocket watch at all, but rather like a massive clock mechanism, the sound emanating from within the stone walls. Tick, 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 each cycle taking exactly 1 second with perfect precision. Remembering Montgomery's note and its warning, I told myself to leave immediately, to return to my office, collect my things, and go home, to forget the dry circle and the impossible ticking. Instead, I found myself moving closer to the mausoleum door, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't explain or resist. Pressing my ear against the cold iron, I listened. The ticking was just one component of what was now a symphony of impossible sound from within. Beneath it ran a low hum, vibrating through the metal and stone. And above it, most disturbing of all, voices, dozens of them, speaking in overlapping whispers, too faint to make out words, but clearly human in origin. I jerked away from the door, my heart pounding. There was no reasonable explanation for what I was hearing. The mausoleum contained only the dead. The dead do not whisper. They do not create mechanical ticking sounds or low, resonant hums. As I stood frozen in indecision, the whisper suddenly ceased. The humming intensified, rising in pitch until it was almost a whine. The ticking accelerated faster and faster, no longer marking seconds, but racing towards some unknown conclusion. Then absolute silence. A moment later, a single voice spoke from within, clear, precise, educated. Montgomery's voice, though I had never heard it in life. Is someone there? The caretaker, perhaps? I should have run. Everything in me screamed to flee, but something stronger held me rooted to the spot, a compulsion that felt external to my own will. Yes, I heard myself reply. It's Blackwood, the cemetery caretaker. Excellent. The voice sounded pleased. I wasn't certain the connection would establish so quickly. The calculations were precise, but one can never account for all variables. Mr. Montgomery? I managed, my mouth dry. You're dead. A sound like laughter, but hollow, emotionless. Death is a threshold, Mr. Blackwood, not an ending. I have simply crossed over. And now, I find myself in position to hold the door open, so to speak. What door? What are you talking about? The barrier between worlds is weakest at midnight, Montgomery replied, echoing what the solicitor had said earlier. With proper preparation and precise timing, it can be breached. Or rather, a communication channel can be established. The implications were too fantastic, too horrifying to accept. Yet I could not deny the evidence of my own senses. I was conversing with a dead man, sealed in his tomb less than an hour earlier. Why? I asked finally. Why establish this channel? Knowledge, of course. Montgomery's voice had taken on a lecturer's tone. Do you realize the scientific value of confirmation that consciousness continues after death? Of direct communication with the deceased? Of potentially mapping what lies beyond? Is that where you are now? Beyond? A pause. Not exactly. I am in between. Neither fully here nor fully there. The pocket watch serves as an anchor, allowing me to maintain this position. And from here, I can perceive both sides. Both sides of what? Reality, Mr. Blackwood. Life and death. Past and future. All are visible from the threshold. Another pause. Would you like to see? A rational part of my mind was screaming warnings, reminded me of Montgomery's written plea not to open the mausoleum before sunrise. But that rational voice was growing fainter, overwhelmed by a burning curiosity and that strange external compulsion that seemed to grip my very thoughts. Yes, I whispered. Show me. You'll need to open the door, Montgomery said. Just a crack, enough to establish direct visual contact. My hand moved to the key in my pocket, the master key that opened every lock in Ravenswood Cemetery, with movements that felt only partially under my control. I inserted it into the mausoleum door and turned. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung inward slightly of its own accord. A thin line of silvery light spilled out from the gap, not the warm yellow of a lamp or the harsh white of electricity, but something colder, more alien. Look, Montgomery commanded. See what I have discovered. I pressed my eye to the narrow opening. What I saw defies complete description, not because it was chaotic or incomprehensible, but because it existed in dimensions my mind could only partially process. The interior of the mausoleum had expanded. The walls remained where they should be, but they also extended infinitely in impossible directions, creating a space that was simultaneously confined and boundless. Montgomery's coffin still rested on its central platform, but the lid was open. The body inside was both present and absent, flickering between states like a faulty television signal. One moment, the perfectly preserved corpse of an elderly man. The next, an empty vessel. The next, something that was neither human nor inhuman, but a complex pattern of light and shadow. Surrounding the coffin, filling the expanded space, were entities I can only describe as presences, consciousness without definite form, shifting and flowing around a central point that was Montgomery. Some appeared vaguely human-shaped, others completely alien. All seemed to be observing, studying, communicating in some manner I couldn't comprehend. And there was Montgomery himself, or what remained of him. His consciousness had become a nexus, a junction point between realms, anchored to his physical remains by the silver pocket watch that now hovered above his body, ticking in that perfect mechanical rhythm I'd heard earlier. Remarkable, isn't it? His voice came from everywhere and nowhere. They've been waiting for someone to create a stable threshold, a permanent doorway. Cold realization washed over me. You're not just communicating with the other side. You're trying to open a permanent passage. Progress requires sacrifice, Mr. Blackwood. Humanity has been trapped in ignorance of what lies beyond for too long. I offer myself as a key, my body as the door, my will as the mechanism. The presences seemed to pulse with greater intensity at his words, pressing closer to the threshold he had created. I sensed eagerness from them, a hungry anticipation that sent shivers down my spine. They want to come through, I said, the truth dawning with horrifying clarity. They want to share knowledge, Montgomery corrected, though something in his tone had changed, a note of doubt or fear that hadn't been present before, to elevate humanity beyond its current limitations. Is that what they told you? Silence. Then, more quietly, they showed me wonders beyond imagination, realities beyond understanding. How could I refuse such an opportunity for advancement? But I wasn't listening anymore. My attention had fixed on the pocket watch hovering above Montgomery's flickering form. Its ticking had changed again, becoming erratic, unpredictable. The shield of symbols engraved on its case was glowing now, each marking pulsing in sequence. The anchor is failing, Montgomery said suddenly, urgency replacing his academic tone. It wasn't designed to maintain such a widespread connection. Too many are attempting to access the threshold at once. The presences were definitely pressing closer now, their amorphous forms becoming more defined, more solid. The boundaries of the expanded space trembled, reality itself seemingly strained by the pressure from beyond. Close the door, Montgomery commanded, his voice now threaded with unmistakable fear. Quickly, before midnight ends. But I hesitated. You asked me to open it. I was mistaken, deceived. They are not what I believed. Close it now, or there won't be a door left closed. The watch was spinning now, its hands whirling in impossible patterns as the symbols flared brighter. Cracks appeared in its silver case, leaking more of that strange, otherworldly light. Acting on instinct rather than understanding, I slammed the mausoleum door shut and turned the key. The lock engaged with sound like thunder, and immediately the dry circle around the mausoleum vanished. Rain poured down, soaking me instantly. From within came a terrible crash, followed by a sound I can only describe as reality tearing. A high, keening note that seemed to vibrate the very air. Then, abrupt silence. I stood there in the downpour, shaking from more than just the cold. Minutes passed before I gathered the courage to press my ear against the door again. Nothing. No ticking. No voices. No humming. I should have left then. Should have reported a vandalism attempt, had the mausoleum sealed with additional measures, forgotten the entire incident. Instead, driven by a need to understand what had happened, I unlocked the door once more and pushed it fully open. The interior was exactly as it should have been. A simple stone chamber with coffins along the walls and Montgomery's new mahogany casket on the central platform. The lid was closed, showing no sign of having been disturbed. Of the expanded space, the presences, the hovering watch, there was no trace. I approached the coffin cautiously, placing my hand on its polished surface. It felt normal, just wood and brass, nothing supernatural. After a moment's hesitation, I pushed against the lid. It moved slightly, not fully secured yet by the interment service. I should not have looked inside. Even now, years later, I wish with every fiber of my being that I had walked away. Montgomery's body lay as it should have, hands folded across his chest, face composed in death's repose. but where his eyes should have been were only empty sockets, not gouged out, but seemingly never there at all. The skin smooth and unbroken across where eyes should be. And his mouth was gone too, the lower portion of his face a blank expanse of flesh. Yet somehow, impossibly, I heard his voice one final time, not aloud, but directly in my mind. They took the parts they needed, the eyes that saw both sides, the mouth that spoke the word of opening. Be grateful they didn't take more. Be vigilant they don't find another way through. I slammed the lid shut and fled the mausoleum, locking it securely behind me. By morning, I had convinced myself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the strange circumstances of the midnight burial. But 3 things prevented me from fully accepting this comfortable explanation. First, the 500 pounds in note remained in my desk drawer, tangible proof that something unusual had occurred. Second, over the following weeks, 3 separate visitors to the cemetery, all strangers to me and to each other, stopped by my office to report hearing ticking sounds from the Montgomery Mausoleum, like a giant clock counting down. And third, most disturbing of all, I began noticing certain visitors to Ravenswood who didn't quite fit, people whose movements were slightly wrong, whose expressions never quite matched their words, whose eyes seemed to focus on things no one else could see. They would come alone, always during rainstorms, and stand near the Montgomery Mausoleum for hours, seemingly oblivious to the weather. I began keeping records of these visitors, descriptions, dates, weather conditions. A pattern emerged. They appeared most frequently at midnight, especially during heavy rainfall. Their numbers increased around certain astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, eclipses, and over time, their appearances became more corporeal, more convincingly human. Whatever Montgomery had attempted hadn't fully succeeded, but neither had it completely failed. The threshold was weakened. The door was still cracked open, if only slightly. For 7 years, I maintained a vigil. I installed additional locks on the mausoleum. I patrolled the cemetery at midnight during rainstorms. I turned away the strange visitors whenever possible, claiming areas were closed for maintenance or repairs. And on nights like tonight, when the rain falls with that particular rhythm, when midnight approaches and the air feels charged with potential, I position myself near the Montgomery Mausoleum with a silver pocket knife. Silver, I've learned, disrupt certain energies and wait. They know me now, these threshold crossers. They avoid me when possible, but they continue to come, continue to test the boundaries, continue to seek a way to widen the crack that Montgomery created. Last month, I found a new caretaker position at a cemetery in another city. I left no forwarding address, told no one where I was going, but in my desk drawer at Ravenswood, I left detailed notes about the Montgomery Mausoleum, the midnight visitors, and the patterns I'd observed. Whether my successor will read them, whether they'll take the threat seriously, I cannot know. So I'm telling you instead, because the rain outside your window has that particular rhythm tonight, because midnight approaches, because the threshold is weakest now, and someone should be watching. If you live near a cemetery, particularly an old Victorian one with elaborate family mausoleums, stay away after dark when it rains. If you notice people who move oddly, whose expressions never quite reach their eyes, whose attention seems fixed on things you cannot perceive, do not engage with them. And if you ever hear ticking from a tomb, a perfect mechanical rhythm like a clock counting down, walk away immediately. Don't look inside. Don't listen to the voices that might call your name. The dead should remain dead. The threshold should remain closed. The other side of midnight is not for the living to witness. Can you still hear the rain? Has its rhythm changed yet? Listen carefully now. Tick, tick, tick.